Be here tonight for two reasons. One, I can't think of a campus I would rather be at to dialogue on this topic. And two, it's an honor for me to have such a distinguished colleague as a representative of the humanist position. He is one of the foremost card-carrying humanists in America, and so I think the debate ought to be a very interesting interchange. Christianity versus humanism. I asked my class not too long ago, what is the greatest problem in America today? Is it ignorance or is it apathy? And one of the students said, I don't know and I don't care. One of the greatest problems in America today is the humanist-Christianity conflict. And I would like to begin by defining the terms. Christianity I take to mean historic classical Christianity, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. Humanism I take to mean secular humanism, as represented, say, by Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. And my thesis is that Christianity is superior to humanism, rationally, scientifically, and socially. And since many dialogues like this are ships passing in the night, I picked several things which will not do that. Christianity and humanism come in sharp contrast, so defined, on a number of issues, on the origin of mankind, on values, on life, and on society. Secular humanists have declared themselves in the manifesto. The projector is not working. Could somebody tell me how to get it on, and could we pause in the time, please? Though it's not going to work, so we'll proceed. Secular humanists have declared themselves in the manifestos 1 and 2, 1933 and 1973, as to their basic beliefs. Christianity, by contrast to secular humanism, believes that there is a creator of the universe. Secular humanists believe there is no creator. Christianity believes in absolute values, absolute God-given values. Secular humanists do not believe in absolute God-given values. They believe in situational ethics and the relative values that come out of the human situation. Christianity believes that all individual life from its very beginning should be protected, and secular humanism does not believe that all individual life from its very beginning should be protected. Christianity believes that all views should be represented in a pluralistic society in the public forum, and secular humanism, despite its statements to the contrary, does not believe that all views should be presented in the public forum. And on those four issues, I would like to suggest that Christianity is rationally, scientifically, and socially superior to secular humanism. Let me begin, first of all, by talking about Christianity versus humanism with respect to the origin of the universe, of life, and of mankind. There are only two basic views with respect to the origin of the universe. Either the universe had a beginning or it didn't have a beginning. If it had a beginning, either it had a cause or it did not have a cause. My contention is that the scientific evidence, which secular humanists claim to believe, actually supports the view that there was a creator of the universe. Let me quote from a contemporary agnostic, Dr. Robert Geiszler, the director and founder of the Goddard Institute for Space Research and one of the top astrophysicists in the United States, a confessed agnostic, who says that the universe is running down, second law of thermodynamics, in a closed, isolated system. The amount of usable energy is decreasing. Therefore, the universe must have had a beginning. If it's winding down, it must have been wound up. If it had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. Another line of evidence that the universe had a beginning is the fact that it is expanding. The work that was done on the Mount Palomar 200-inch telescope proves that the universe is expanding, which extrapolation backwards shows that the universe came from a point in time, a point of beginning from which it has been expanding, known as the Big Bang Theory. The third line of evidence that has convinced almost the last doubting Thomas is that Penzias and Wilson, who were given Nobel Prize for their discovery of the radiation echo, show that the radiation echo given off by the entire universe is the same wavelength as that which would have been created by a gigantic explosion when the universe came into existence. These three lines of evidence, says Dr. Robert Jastrow, lead to the following conclusion, that the universe must have had a supernatural cause, a cause that goes beyond the natural world. He says astronomers now find that they have painted themselves in a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an active creation to which you can trace the seed of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on Earth. And they found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. Then he said, elsewhere, the scientist's pursuit of the past ends in the moment of creation. This is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but theologians. They have always accepted the word of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The astronomical evidence is led right back to the same point that a literal understanding of Genesis 1:1 has always yielded, that there was a moment of creation. Then he says, now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same, meaning the chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply in a definite moment of time in a flash of light and energy. Genesis put it this way, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Then Dr. Robert Geisler ends his book with this famous line. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. As he's about to conquer the highest peak, pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. No doubt reading Genesis 1:1, because the scientific evidence is stronger for the Christian view that there was a creation and a creator. Same thing is true of the origin of life. Life either began by spontaneous generation, which humanists believe, or it began by special creation, by some intelligent intervention. Now let me define one of the distinguishing features of life. A famous biologist said, life is distinguished by specified complexity. Living organisms are distinguished by their specified complexity. Crystals fail to qualify as living because they lack complexity. Random mixtures of polymers fail to qualify because they lack specificity. But living things have specified complexity. That's very important. We're not talking about order. Crystals have order. We're talking about specified complexity, which crystals do not have. Now here's what scientists have discovered, that the statistical analysis of a human language is mathematically identical to the statistical analysis of the four-letter alphabet of the genetic code. So that when you look at a living thing which has the genetic code, the DNA, it has the same specified complexity that you see in a written language. Now, if it takes an intelligent being to produce one, it is reasonable to assume that it took an intelligent being to produce the other. For example, if you get up tomorrow morning, you look on the table, and you see written in your alphabet cereal on the table, I love you, Mary. You will not assume the cat knocked it over. You will not assume the fan was blowing on it all night. That would be a humanist explanation. You assume that an intelligent being produced it. Why? Because it has specified complexity. How much specified complexity is there in the first living thing? There's a picture of the DNA splitting, taken by an electron microscope. Compliments the Wadley Institute of Cancer Research in Dallas. One single cell animal has enough specified complexity that is spelled out in English would fill a whole volume of encyclopedia. Now I ask you, is it more rational to believe that Webster's unabridged dictionary resulted from an explosion in a printing shop, or that some intelligent being produced it? A single cell animal has that much complexity in it. In fact, if you were walking by Mount Rushmore and you saw that, would you conclude that was wind erosion, water erosion, or would you conclude an intelligent being produced it? Seems to me that it's far more reasonable to believe that there is a creator of the first simple living thing. Carl Sagan, who is listening for one single message from outer space in the SETI program, there's a telescope in the Caribbean, there's one at Harvard, and they're tuned to outer space. What are they listening for? E.T. What is E.T. going to say? Going to give a single message. And when they get a single message from outer space, they will conclude they're intelligent beings. Why? Because the message has specified complexity. You can tell the difference between static and an intelligent message even if you don't know the language. Now, if a single message from outer space is grounds to conclude there's an intelligent civilization, then certainly the specified complexity in the human brain, which Carl Sagan says equals 10 to the 14th bits, some 20 million volumes, as many books in all the large libraries in the world put together, that's how much specified complexity exists in the human brain. It is absolutely unreasonable, it is unscientific to assume that man came from blind forces such as secular humanists say that there was no intelligent creator. The scientific evidence points to an intelligent creator of the universe and of life and of man, and this is a far superior explanation to that given by secular humanists. Now, there are certain moral consequences, and I'd like to turn to my second point. The Christian view of values is superior to the secular humanist view of values. In fact, it was Nietzsche in his book Gay Science in 1882 who said, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. As a result of that, Dostoevsky put it this way, if God does not exist, everything would be permitted. Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous existential humanist, in the last line of his book, Being and Nothingness, said, it doesn't matter whether you get drunk or go out and lead the nations. There is no ethical significance to acts. We create all of our own meaning. Now, I would like to contend that the best summary of the last 2 centuries is that God died in the 19th century and that man has died in the 20th century. Or more properly put, man killed God in the 19th century and man is killing man in the 20th century, and that a direct consequence of accepting that there is no God, that man is just an animal and he's evolved by purely natural processes, is the abuse of mankind that has occurred, and that secular humanism is responsible in large degree for this abuse of mankind and is not humanist at all, it is anti-human. Let me give you one example of Hitler taking Darwin's conclusion and carrying it to the ethical consequence of weeding out the inferior races. The subtitle of Darwin's book on the origin of species is a racist subtitle. Talks about superior races of mankind. Hitler said, well, if evolution has produced the superior race, and if evolution weeds out the inferior races, why can't we use the model of evolution as our ethical basis and weed out the inferior Jewish race? With that, he killed 6 million Jews. Now, humanists have put it a little differently, especially American humanists, many of whom would deplore some of what Hitler did, but the same logical consequence follows. In the Manifesto 1, 1933, and 2, 1973, secular humanists declare that ethics is relativistic and situational. There are no absolute God-given moral values. Christians believe that God made man in his image and likeness, and that it is an absolute obligation to protect human life, all individual human life from the very beginning. But humanists affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. They're autonomous and situational. And in the area of sexuality, they suggest that we should be opposed to certain orthodox creedal statements, referring, of course, to Christianity, and that we should favor, notice, abortion, euthanasia, among other things. Now, abortion means to take a human life before it is born. And I would like to suggest to you that the scientific evidence favors the Christian point of view of protecting life from the moment of conception, as opposed to the secular humanist view that abortion is justified. For example, in 1868, under the auspices of the American Medical Society, a book was produced in which they said, physicians have now arrived at the unanimous opinion that the fetus in utero is alive from the very moment of conception. The willful killing of a human being at any stage of its existence is murder. Abortion is in reality a crime against the infant, its mother, the family circle, and society. Now, if in 1868 physicians said that, what are physicians saying today? We had a subcommittee hearing before the United States Congress on April 23rd, 1981. Virtually every one of the experts in genetics and fetology said that life begins at conception. They quoted sources from all over the world. I have only a few here before you. Notice what they said. It is not a matter of metaphysical contention. It is a scientific fact that life begins at conception. to accept the fact that after fertilization has taken place, a new human being has come into existence is no longer a matter of taste or opinion. Now, every humanist is entitled to his own religious opinion, but I am concerned with scientific fact, and the scientific fact is that life begins at conception. Dr. Jerome Lejeune, one of the famous geneticists in the world, said, "We now know what it feels. We have listened to what it hears, smelled what it tastes, and we have really seen him dancing full of grace and youth. The human nature of the being from conception to old age is not a metaphysical contention. It is plain evidence." What is the evidence? What have secular humanists encouraged in the light of their view that abortion on demand is acceptable? Between 1973, Roe v. Wade, and 1986, we have killed 20 million unborn Americans. Now I ask you, is that human? Is that humane? Is that the kind of value that we want to perpetuate in our society? Just to get a picture, Hitler only killed 6 million Jews. We've already killed 20 million Americans. That's 4,100 a day, one every 20 seconds in the United States. Never send to ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. We only killed 1.2 Americans in all the wars put together in the history of the United States for 200 years. We've only killed 56,000 in the Vietnam War, American soldiers dying in the line of duty. We've only killed 2.4 million in all the traffic accidents in the last 83 years. And yet we have killed 1.5 million every year in the United States by abortion. What are we talking about? Here's the cover off of Life magazine. Is it vegetable? Is it mineral? Is it human? We know it's human. It's genetically human. It's functionally human. The only thing birth does is change your method of feeding and your location. Changing your location doesn't change your human status. And yet, in spite of that, in America, you can do this in the name of advanced humanistic, progressive, relativistic situational ethic. 2 twin babies who were aborted by salt poison, breathed in its lungs, burns the lungs out of the inside, burns the body on the outside. 4,000 babies are killed each day. Or another method, you can take the babies and tear them into pieces and then suck them out of the womb with a vacuum cleaner, 29 times as powerful as that used to clean the carpet in your house. Not only that, but in America today and in the world, in the name of humanism, we are engaging in human experimentation on these little babies. We're taking these tiny little babies, born alive by hysterotomy abortion, and experimenting on them, cutting their chest open, taking their hearts out, see how long they'll beat on the table, taking organs from them, transplanting them. One doctor cut off the heads of 12 babies, 6 months after Roe v. Wade in 1973, cut off the heads of 12 babies, put something into their head to keep blood pumping, kept the heads alive, and experimented with them. I ask you, is this human? Is it humanistic? Abortion leads to infanticide, and infanticide to euthanasia. None of us is free from this humanistic influence. Notice abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. Same patient, same arguments, and same result. Paul Ramsey said there are many good arguments for abortion, but there are all also good arguments for infanticide. And Joseph Fletcher said abortion is prenatal euthanasia, and euthanasia is postnatal abortion. I would like to appeal to you. Who has the more scientific explanation for the origin of the universe? Who has the more humane view of human values? Who has the most kind and acceptable view of human nature? Is it the Christian point of view, the Judeo-Christian point of view that was manifest in our culture and in our Declaration of Independence, or is it a secular humanist point of view? Thank you. Is the microphone on and are people hearing? I'm glad to have this chance to set the record straight respecting secular humanism. Secular humanism is a worldview based on philosophical naturalism, which, in the memorable words of Ernest Nagel,
maintains the existential and causal primacy of organized matter in the executive order of nature. What that means is secular humanists affirm the world of daily empirical experience and of scientific inquiry, and do not affirm any other world, any better or so-called spiritual world. In short, with respect to all the gods of all the religions of the world, secular humanists are either atheists or agnostics. But do not assume that this is as negative as you think. No agnostic means to profess ignorance of something that is known, and no atheist intends to deny existence to something that is known to exist. Atheism and agnosticism relate not nearly so much to the world as they do to what other people have to say about the world. Let me give you an example. I recall for the first time in my boyhood state of Michigan seeing it snow as a very small child. Out of a threatening, dark, angry sky, millions of little white things began to flow down, or to fall down, and someone told me that Mother Goose was picking her goslings. I was amazed. Those were feathers. I am now an a-goosist. I deny categorically that Mother Goose has anything whatsoever to do with making it snow. Now, there are some of you here in the South who don't know much about snow and have very open minds, and I suspect you might be called agnosto-goosists. And there are others of you who have kept your faith and are goosists. Now, the same thing is true with Jack Frost. I am an a-frostist. I deny that Jack Frost, with his little palette of colors and his little brush, goes out in the fall and makes the leaves turn color. Those of you who don't know much about botany may be agnosto-frostists. And those of you who have kept your childhood faith are doubtless frostists. Now, it's exactly the same way with the Jehovah of the Old Testament. The Jehovah of the Old Testament is a conception as ignorant as the people who created that conception. Those of you who deny that there is any such being are atheists, of course. Those of you who don't know, who wish to keep an open mind, are agnostics, and those, like my opponents, who have kept their childhood faith, are, of course, theists. Now, it may alarm you or disturb you that somebody would put the Jehovah of the Old Testament in the same category with Jack Frost and Mother Goose, but they have much in common. All three are human conceptions. All three have some meaning but no known reference. And all three are explanatory fictions. The more you know about this universe and its complexities, so nicely described earlier, the more you know about this universe, ranging from astronomy to zoology and back again, the more you know the God of the Old Testament is too ignorant to have created this world, too incompetent to sustain it, and too mercurial of temperament to care very much about it. Now, if one is going to deny any other world than the world of empirical experience and of science, if one is going to deny the supernatural, then one simultaneously is going to deny the sacred, and is going to contend that the only properties that objects have are natural properties. There are no sacred properties. Now, it just happens that the best definition of religion is Durkheim's. Durkheim defined it as a system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, belief in which unites the believers into a moral community known as the church. Secular humanists either deny that there is any sacred dimension or hold in doubt any claims that there is. We accept no sacred being, worship no sacred being, and take no orders from any sacred being. Unlike Christians who belong to a welfare religion, always hands out, asking for something, asking for moral responsibility to be abolished in the past, asking for forgiveness, asking for cleansing, asking for redemption, and most egotistically of all, asking for everlasting life, we ask for no such things. We have no sacred rituals, belong to no ecclesiastical organization, and believe when we are dead that we shall be exactly what we were before conception, namely nothing at all. And yet I noticed that my opponent flipped the word religious in there at one point. Some religion, Brother Geiszler, some religion. Every honest person here knows I'm talking about irreligion. The second component of secular humanism is that it relies upon the scientific method to provide the best information we have about the world. I did not say the only, I did not say sacred information, I did not say infallible information, I merely said the best information we have about the world. And in point of fact, in every advanced nation of the world, technically speaking, science is now the dominant mode of knowledge. Hasn't always been so. 700 years ago, when my opponent would have felt much more at home, theological knowledge was the dominant form of knowledge in the world. 150 years ago in Germany, philosophical knowledge was the dominant mode of knowledge in the world. But in all advanced, technically advanced societies, science is now the dominant mode of knowledge in the world, and it gives my opponent and people like him fits, because scientific method is godless. You can find that out for yourself very easily. No one has to presuppose anything whatsoever about a deity to commence the kind of critical observation that leads to scientific discovery. There is not one single divine variable to be found in any of the experimental groups which are being manipulated against some control group. There is not a single theological variable that needs to be plugged in to understand confirmation and disconfirmation tactics, and whatever confirmed theories emerge or laws of nature are absolutely up for grabs as to whether they exhibit teleology or not. The dominant mode of knowledge in the modern world, like it or not, is godless. Well, if you can't fall back on science to defend your position, what do you fall back on? Well, the first thing you fall back on is the specious use of reason, which I shall address myself to when it comes time to rebut. If you can't use science and you can't use reason to maintain your position, well, then next you fall back on faith. But all of you who know your dictionaries well will know that the relationship of faith to credulity is such that the stronger your faith, the greater your credulity, and the higher your gullibility. If you rely on faith in something called an objective revelation, well, then you're very gullible indeed. Oh, yes, I know the Pope is in contact with the Holy Ghost. I know Ezra Taft Benson is in daily contact with the God who inspired not only the Bible but the Book of Mormon. I know that Oral Roberts has just learned that he's going to die in a few weeks if he doesn't raise $4 million. And I know that Jim Jones received a revelation that his disciples were to drink purple Kool-Aid. Now, if you believe any of that, you are very gullible indeed. I suspect my opponent would prefer to lodge his faith in something called an objective revelation, the Holy Bible, but that won't work either. The Bible is a very ignorant book. If you look at Genesis 1, one of 4 creation stories in the Bible, you'll discover that there was no big bang, but a big wash. There's wall-to-wall water everywhere, water above the sky that dribbles down through holes up there, water below the flat earth stretched out over it. Psalm 136:6. You'll discover that there's water everywhere, but science knows nothing of this wall-to-wall water. Furthermore, isn't it interesting that the Bible knows nothing of the primate order? Nearly 200 species of apes and monkeys, the Bible is quite ignorant of these. The God of the Bible knows no more than the ancient Jews who wrote it. And if you think that serpents eat dust, Genesis 3:14b, I suggest you make an appointment with one of our herpetologists over on Ag Hill. Then, too, the Bible is a contradictory work. In Hebrews 6:18, we're told that God by nature cannot lie. And yet, if we look at 1 Kings 22:23, we discover he sends a lying spirit to certain prophets. If we take a look at Ezekiel 14:9, we discover the following interesting word, that the Lord says, "And if the prophet be deceived, when he hath spoken a thing, then I, the Lord, have deceived him." And in 2 Thessalonians 2:11, he sends a gigantic delusion upon certain people that they might believe a lie. Well, with a deity like that, you can't tell whether you're dealing with a good God who allows evil or whether you're dealing with an evil God who allows good. The Bible is also filled with historical fraud of the rewriting of history for the sake of theological presuppositions. If you take a look at Isaiah 7, you will see a prophecy in which a young girl who has not yet had her first menstrual period, one of the lesser-known meanings of virgin, you will discover that a girl who has not yet had her first menstrual period is going to conceive in the ordinary way, And by the time the royal child she brings forth has his bar mitzvah, about 15 years in the future perhaps, a certain military threat will have disappeared. Well, whoever wrote Matthew 1:23 rips that out of the Old Testament, takes it out of context, changes its meaning, applies it to somebody to whom it doesn't apply, and tries to make it seem that Mary, the virgin, is going to be with a child whose name shall be Emmanuel. The only difficulty is nobody ever called Jesus Emmanuel in the New Testament. It appears only once, and that is in the bogus prophecy. And so Matthew has to manufacture an angel to come and tell Joseph, call the kid Jesus, because in point of fact that's what his name was. Now what you're dealing with here is pious fraud, but that's fraud by any other name, and holy humbug is just as much humbug as any other kind of humbug. Now the simple fact is, when you take this all together, you recognize that Christian theology is scientifically unsupported and probably unsupportable, philosophically suspect at best and disreputable at worst, and historically fraudulent. Now I ask you, why should any secular humanist believe in an objective revelation in the Holy Bible? For that matter, why should any of you? Now the third point is that secular humanism believes that humanity itself is the source, center, and end of human ethics. In Bernowski's words, we are social solitaries. We are members of a social primate species. We must live in community to live well, and yet we are so intelligent, so egotistical, and have so many wants that we put ourselves in opposition both to each other and to our communities. With a creature like that, both manners and morals flow naturally. It wouldn't matter whether there were no God or a God. It wouldn't matter if there were many gods or one. It wouldn't matter if there were 3 gods in one or 10 gods in two. Ethics and morality are natural to the human species. And to say that the human species is the center of ethics merely means the primary preoccupation of ethics is with people, not with animals, although animals could be included, and not with superhuman beings about which we know nothing. To say that humanity is the end of ethics merely means that we are the beneficiaries of our own good behavior and the victims of our own bad behavior. I recommend to you most strongly John Dewey, who recognized 3 approaches to ethics. First, the impulsive; second, the habitual; and third, the reflective. I don't think either my opponent or I need to talk about the kind of ethics that shoots from the hip and asks questions later. Sometimes it works, most times it doesn't, and I think we can ignore it. My opponent is a representative of the habitual response to ethical problems. He is attempting to replicate the past. He is attempting to respond to ethical problems as the fathers and the fathers of the fathers and ultimately the God of the fathers responded, presumably, to ethical problems. There's much to be said for this. It's a wonderful way to teach ethics to kids, by habit. It's also true that there's much in our past that's worthwhile and needs to be preserved. But to assume that one does right by replicating the past is to assume that the past was somehow more perfect and not in need of reformation. It is also a very poor recipe for dealing with surprises in human life, because the fathers weren't very good prophets, nor was the God of the fathers a very good prophet. In point of fact, if you take this kind of approach to ethics, then you are replicating what is presumed to have been revealed to the fathers by some God who resembles very much an oriental despot or perhaps the dictator of a banana republic. Let me ask you some questions. Supposing you look up chapter and verse and tell me whether or not the Supreme Court did properly when it allowed scientists to patent new life forms, designer bugs, if you will. Tell me whether or not the Supreme Court or any court would do rightly to take a child away from a family, a loving family, because it believes that family is medically abusing the child and that the child as an American citizen deserves life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Suppose we have here the opportunity of giving a growth hormone to an ordinary child because the parents believe if the child gets bigger than average, the child being taller than most will have a better chance in business, industry, or sports, or politics, leadership, something of that sort. And this is not at all far-fetched. What does God have to say about that? Let us think about a woman who wishes to get pregnant, whose husband cannot make her pregnant, and to avoid even the appearance of evil, she asks for an in vitro fertilization of one of her ova by a sperm or by sperm from one of her husband's brothers. What do the Scriptures say about that? What do the Scriptures have to say about 1,000 issues of a legal and medical sort taking place every day in this country, having to do with people whose lives have been prolonged far beyond the time when they normally would have died, and who now find life living hell and ask to have the machine turned off? What does God say about that? You will look in vain for all of this. John Dewey's point was not to jettison the entire past, but to try to be as scientific as possible about moral issues, to take a look at what's wrong, piece by piece. And I think both my opponent and I would agree that there is an absolute epidemic of teenage pregnancies in this country that is terribly detrimental. We would both be opposed to its continuing and to its increase. But what should we do about it? Frighten them, threaten them, play upon their ignorance? Or shall we take a look at the causes of it as best we can, try to discover what kinds of incentives, what kind of social policies, what kinds of inducements might be used to turn around a very bad situation indeed? Well, what Dewey was talking about was trying to be as scientific as possible about remedies for bad moral and social situations, and by being experimental with them. He wasn't jettisoning absolutes because he wished to be mean. He recognized they didn't work very well, and that one needed rather to be experimental. The bottom line has to do with consequences, not with some alleged moral absolute laid down by some god of some ancient people around Bedouin campfires in the past. I propose to you that Dewey has a better recipe, and that my opponent is tied to the dead hand of the past.
My opponent has made it very easy for me because I really have nothing to rebut. I listened for 20 minutes and did not hear him give a single rational, scientific argument in favor of secular humanism. All I heard was a tirade against God, a tirade against the Bible, a classic in ad hominem evasion of the law of rationality. He's a philosophy teacher. He's a teacher of logic. I have taught both for years. I counted at least a half a dozen evasions of the law of rationality, from argumentum ad hominem, the abusive form, to argumentum ab annis, on through the list of diverting the issue, red herring. The truth of the matter is, secular humanists pronounce pious platitudes. They recite their creed. They tell you their religious convictions, but they have no scientific evidence. They have no rational arguments for it, and all they are doing is pontificating a dead faith. Let me tell you exactly the opposite of what you were led to believe. You were led to believe that secular humanism is not a religion. First of all, in the Humanist Manifesto 1933, they begin by saying, to establish such a religion is a major necessity of the present. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. They declared themselves a religion. Wasn't Jerry Falwell or Tim LaHaye, wasn't the Pope, the secular humanists who first called themselves a religion, and they creedified in 1933. And Reverend McKown here is a minister in the humanist religion. He performs weddings. He gives eulogies at funerals. He is recognized by the laws of the state of Alabama as a minister. Secular humanists want you to believe they aren't religious. But why is it that they write books entitled The Religion of, or chapters entitled The Religion of Evolutionary Humanism? Or books, Religion Without Revelation, or Religion Without God? Why is it they have a journal called The Religious Humanist? Why is it that the Supreme Court in 1961 recognized secular humanism by name as an official religion in America? Secular humanism is a religion. We've just heard a good exponent of this religious point of view here tonight. In fact, John Dunphy, who won the prize in the Humanist Journal for this article a number of years ago, tells us what their religion believes. He said, I'm convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classrooms by teachers who correctly perceive their role as the proselytizers of a new faith a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or large state university. Most of us believe that someone should not be able to articulate his religious convictions being paid by the taxpayers of the United States. And yet we have examples of secular humanists, of ministers in a secular humanist religion who do that daily throughout the United States and who teach things that are contrary not only to the principles of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, but of the taxpayers who support them. This same man, John Dunphy, says this: the Bible is not merely another book, an outmoded and archaic book, or even an extremely influential book. It has been and remains an incredibly dangerous book. It and the various Christian churches which are parasitic upon it have been directly responsible for most of the wars, persecutions, and outrages which humankind has perpetrated upon itself over the past 2,000 years. That's what secular humanists believe, and that's the kind of creed they want promulgated by taxpayers' dollars. I say to you, secular humanism is a religion, and Dr. McKown has not led you correctly to think that it wasn't. He also spoke about science and its antithesis to the faith. Between 1620 and 1860, every major area of modern science, with few exceptions, was started by someone who believed in a creator, that man was created, that there were moral values that derived from this. I'm talking about men like Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Agassiz, Simpson, Mendel, Pasteur, Kelvin, Lister, Ramsay. I'm talking about Galileo and Copernicus and Lord Bacon, who wrote Novum Organum. These were people who believed in God, motivated by their belief in creation of the world, and therefore gave rise to modern science. It is not antithetical to the faith. The literal facts we gave you of the evidence for the Big Bang origin of the universe, the evidence for an intelligent creation of first life, is scientific fact, and scientific inference from that is leading many scientific minds to the feet of the Creator. Fred Hoyle, former proponent of atheism and the articulator of the steady state theory, wrote a book called Evolution from Space, published by Dent, 1981. In it, he concluded that the evidence is so strong for an intelligent creator of life that he gave up his atheism and accepts an intelligent creator of the universe. His colleague, Wick Ramasine, who co-authored the book, said, to believe that life did not come from an intelligent creator is like believing that a Boeing 747 resulted from a tornado raging through a junkyard. That, I commend to you, is irrational, it's unscientific, and thank God that scientists are recognizing in increasing numbers that evidence points to a creator. Let me also speak to this matter of secular humanism and its openness and its belief in humanistic and progressive values, a la John Dewey. Why is it that these are the humanists who are saying things like this? Yes, we believe in all points of view. Yes, we believe in a free and open democratic society, but we deplore efforts by fundamentalists, especially in the United States, to invade the science classroom, requiring that creation theory be taught to students and requiring it be included in biology textbooks. Serious threat to both academic freedom and the integrity of the educational process. Why, if they're open? Why, if they want all points of view to be represented? Why, if they're fair? Why, if they believe in democratic social ethics, do they oppose what almost half of Americans believe and what 3/4 of Americans believe should be taught, creation alongside of evolution in the classroom? In 1925, Clarence Darrow, the ACLU criminal attorney, representative of the humanist cause in the Scopes trial, said this: it is bigotry for public schools to teach only one theory of origins. In 1981, in Arkansas, at the creation evolution trial, where I was a witness, the first witness for the defense, I sat there for 9 days and heard the ACLU argue, in effect, it is bigotry for public schools to teach two theories of origin. Now I ask you, has bigotry changed since 1925, or just the bigot? In 1925, we had fundamentalist bigots who only wanted their view taught. In 1987, we have humanist bigots who only want their view taught. They'll tell you stories about, well, it's not science. If it's not science, then scientists aren't scientists. Because between 1620 and 1860, virtually every major scientist believed in the Creator and creation, the very things the court has ruled cannot be taught in the public school. If it's not science, then hundreds of thousands of scientists today aren't. Then what I said to you, the evidence that points to a Creator in the beginning of the universe, isn't scientific. In fact, it's sophisticated bigotry. It reminds me of Voltaire's story about the black ants on the black ant hill and the red ants on the red ant hill, and the red ants looked at the black ants and said, "You're not ants, and that's not an ant hill." For someone who's an evolutionist to look at creation and say that's not science is simply sophisticated bigotry. We started here in our country in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now notice, inscribed indelibly in that birth certificate of all Americans is the belief in a Creator, the belief that man was created, that he has thirdly certain God-given unalienable moral rights. Those are the three things that secular humanists repudiate, that the manifestos say are not true. So not only is secular humanism unscientific, irrational, and antisocial, but secular humanism is anti-American. Its basic three principles are opposed to the Declaration of Independence. I think that the best thing that a secular humanist could do is to take a look at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He believed the words that he inscribed there. If you stand in front of his imposing figure and look out over the water at the White House and look up the pillars to the granite on the top, you'll see these words. God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? A Christian perspective of the Creator, a Christian perspective of man created in the image and likeness of God, a Christian perspective of unalienable God-given moral rights will preserve that. A secular humanist perspective will destroy it. Thank you.
My opponent is engaged in so much propaganda, it's very difficult to know where to start. He cites the Declaration of Independence as though it had the force of law, but doesn't bother to take a look at the 6 goals of the preamble to the Constitution, no one of which has any theological component whatsoever. Doesn't recognize that George Washington himself kept all mention of God out of the Constitution, that there's not a single theological idea in it. There is no appeal to anything religious. It is utterly and completely a secular document, and he knows that as well as I do. With respect to God, Bertrand Russell destroyed everything my opponent has had to say tonight when he said 50 years ago, if everything has to have a cause, then God has to have a cause too. How shall we explain the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause? Well, pretty soon we get into an infinite regress. And Russell went on and said, and if there is anything that does not have to have a cause, it could just as well be the physical universe as God. My opponent continues to appeal to a darker mystery to try to explain a lighter mystery, and it will not succeed at all. Now, with respect to some claims about abortion, for example, I don't know of a single secular humanist who recommends that anybody have an abortion, unless there's a medical reason for it. I think all secular humanists would be very happy if there were no unwanted children born in this country. I don't know of anybody who wants an unwanted conceptus being conceived, or an unwanted fetus. But he makes it look as though we're out there trying to convince all sorts of people, including his fellow Christians, who went in a really tight squeeze, go and get abortions too, as though we have somehow incited them to do that. Now, let me just call to your attention the fact that there are many reasons to be against abortion. There are intellectual reasons, there are emotional reasons, there are perhaps social and economic reasons. I wouldn't care to give the entire list of reasons against it. But the one thing you can't do is support an anti-abortion principle on the basis of the Bible. There is no single commandment that says, thou shalt not abort a fetus nor suffer thyself to have an abortion. The God of the Old Testament, if he had seen that as a problem, could just as well have added that. What a terrible oversight. Furthermore, in Exodus 21:22, where it is said, and if men fall to fighting and strike a woman, and the child pass from her, or she miscarries, but no mischief follows. Well, gee, you'd think that's mischief enough, wouldn't you? If no mischief follows, that is to say, if no damage comes to the woman, well then, the man and the various judges shall get together on some penalty. Of course, if further mischief follows, if the woman herself dies, then an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. It's also very interesting that in Numbers 5:11 and following, there is a recipe for aborting women who are believed to have been unfaithful to their husbands. It's called the trial of bitter waters. The woman who is suspected by her husband, just suspected, no necessary evidence, just suspected of having dallied with somebody else, is taken to the priest and is made to drink a certain swill composed of water plus some of the sweepings off the tabernacle floor, plus the ink that has been washed off the charge or the bill of charges. And if the woman has truly been unfaithful, then when she drinks this swill, her belly is supposed to swell and her thighs are supposed to diminish, and that's supposed to be proof positive. Well, what about the little fetus all this time? Not one word about that little person that has all the rights that God meant for it to have. Your own Bible gives you a recipe for how to abort. Furthermore, Hosea 9:14 finds Hosea, that wonderful loving prophet, praying for certain women to have dry breasts and miscarrying wombs. Well, there are other things that one might talk about. My opponent is very concerned about ancient history. He continues to confuse religious humanists with secular humanists. Religious humanists try very hard to be religious about their humanism, but by and large they fail. They founder against the Durkheimian definition I gave you earlier. They don't really have anything sacred, and therefore they can't make the grade. As for secular humanists, we are not to be lumped with religious humanists. And believe me, as soon as I attend my first meeting and hereafter on the American Humanist Association, we shall sever, if I have anything to do with it, any and all ties with religious humanism. Furthermore, to keep on quoting a document from 1933 as though I were somehow bound by it is absurd. I do not subscribe to the first Humanist Manifesto. It was a botch. And there are a bunch of people who are ready to rewrite the second Humanist Manifesto because it leans a little bit too much left of center. We have nowadays conservatives and libertarians and all manner of folk who are joining the American Humanist Association, and it is completely and totally a secular organization. Your local judge does not become a religious person just because he has been empowered by the state to perform marriages. And whoever said that somebody who gives eulogies at the time of death has to become a divine? It is true. I was once an ordained minister and practiced as such for 9 years, and believe me, I know the difference between that and what I am now. Although my opponent seems to have some confusion over this. But there are many other points that he has raised, points having to do with how intolerant we are. All we're asking for is that there be a free market of ideas, that we have many, many more debates of this sort. In fact, I am ready at any time, at any place, before a reasonably neutral audience, although you're not neutral, before a reasonably neutral audience, with a good moderator, I'm prepared to debate this man over and over and over again. It's somewhat like shooting fish in a barrel. Now, there are scientists and there are non-scientists. There are creationists and there are non-creationists, but there are no scientific creationists. That's an oxymoron. That's a contradiction in terms. Science does not deal with anything that is supernatural. It does not imply, it does not infer, it does not involve any divine variables as it is practiced. It is utterly and completely irrelevant to cite a big, long catalog of people from 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, who happen to be believers. Yes, most people have been believers. But what does that have to do with the practice of science? Nothing whatsoever. The practice of science remains entirely godless, as I told you earlier, and I defy my opponent to go to our library and look at any of the hundreds of thousands of scientific articles there. I defy him to go, I defy you to go, and find one single theological reference, variable, or presupposition. You won't find any of those. Now, why should scientific creationists be so surprised when the scientific community doesn't want them smuggling in an ancient Semitic creation story under the guise of science? I wonder if my colleague, who doubtless knows the creation narrative in the Protagoras dialogue of Plato, would like to have that offered as a possible alternative. After all, there isn't just one theory of origins. There are hundreds of theories of origins. What the scientific establishment has said is, it is the business of the secular state to present secular knowledge to our children, leaving it to the home and the church to supply other forms of information. I would love to talk to you. I would love to talk to you about the creation account in the Protagoras dialogue. It's a very much better one than the one you find in Genesis in some respects. It explains some things better than Genesis explains them. Of course, Genesis 1 and 2 don't explain things the same way, and the 8th chapter of Proverbs gives a different creation story, and there's yet another one in bits and pieces of Job and Psalms, and of course in the 3rd chapter of 2 Peter, there is three-world creationism, quite a different an elaboration on creationism. My opponent has made it seem as though the creation story in the Bible is one, unique, and scientific. There is no one creation story in the Bible, but no one of them is scientific. So it is not a matter of intolerance when scientific creationists are told, no thank you, don't bring your stuff into school. It is a matter of the integrity of science. And I hope there are some scientists here tonight who have heard what has been said. Their profession is being attacked through attacks on the American human. My colleague would have all the same intellectual and theoretical problems tomorrow that he has today, because his real problem is modern secular science. Now, I'm awfully glad that my opponent has raised the issue of moral absolutes. There's a moral absolute in the Bible that I'm especially fond of. It's in the 6th chapter of Luke, the 30th verse, where it is said, "Give to every man that asketh of thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again." Now, Jesus himself says that to his disciples, and I presume Christians believe it, and so I'm going to ask my opponent for his money. I'm going to beg him for his money. I'll get on one of my knees and ask him for his money. No, all of it, not just one, all of it. No. He has more than $1 in there. I'm not going to accept $1. I want everything that's in there, but I'll leave him his wallet. I don't wish to be mean.
We're going to take a break for about 10 minutes now, so you have a chance to write. Overwhelmed by questions, so we have tried to choose some that are representative of some of the others. We will begin with Dr. Geiszler. You said that Christianity supports the voicing of all opinions. Explain the repression of secular humanism that is apparently found in some textbooks.
As a matter of fact, just the opposite of the question is the truth, and I recommend a book to you by New York Professor Paul Vitz entitled Censorship, Evidence of Bias in Our Children's Textbooks. He did a study of the major textbooks used in the United States, and he came to the following conclusion. I'd like to read from the book for you. He said, indeed, the word marriage, wedding, husband, wife do not occur once in these books. Nowhere is it suggested that being a mother or homemaker was worthy an important role for a woman. In the treatment of the past 100 or 200 years is so devoid of reference to religion as to give the impression that it has almost ceased to exist in America. And the book is filled with documentary cases of how the textbooks systematically eliminate a Judeo-Christian point of view and encourage a humanist point of view. A study done by two Eastern professors recently showed that of the 88% of the 300 media elite that were tested turn out to be secular humanists in their perspective. Similar studies have been done in Texas and elsewhere in the United States. The truth of the matter is that the Supreme Court of the United States between 61 and 81 has institutionalized the major premises of secular humanism, and even if one would want to teach Christian values in the public schools, he couldn't. The only values that he could legitimately, constitutionally teach as interpreted by the Supreme Court are humanist values. So what I would like to see is an openness and fairness of both points of view, that the Judeo-Christian point of view could be expressed in the schools as well.
Well, I agree completely that with respect to religion, we ought to tell children the truth. And one of the things that children would learn if they were told the truth about religion is that Paul Witz's church persecuted the Huguenots, who came to the United States to escape that persecution in France. Now, it just so happens that the Archdiocese of New York quashed a Macmillan text that said the Huguenots, or many of them at least, came to the United States to avoid persecution. The Roman Catholic Church found that disagreeable, and so the book was rewritten to say the Huguenots wanted a dandy sea trip and a change of air. Now, I am willing, Brother Geiszler, for us to teach the truth about religion, and your side of the story is going to be very dark and bloody. It's going to be filled with persecutions. It's going to be filled with witch trials. It's going to be filled with a great many unseemly things. I regret that the book publishers don't have the courage to ask people who know what they're writing about to write about it. They do things by committee so they can sell books that are as little offensive as possible. But if you think there's trouble in the country right now, let the truth about religion be told in the schools.
The next question is for Dr. McKown. If it is your belief that values are situational, relative, and that is to say no absolute values exist, do you not intend the above statement to be taken as an absolute? Please comment.
Well, I can't help being a human being, and I don't suppose you can help being a human being either. And as far as we can tell, we are a particular kind of social primate, and I try to describe that by saying social solitaries. Morals, and don't forget, I'm adding manners too. Would any of you care to comment on absolute manners? Manners are relative to one's culture, and morals are relative to one's culture. Not all moral and mannerly behavior are the same all over the world at all times in history. That does not mean that there are not some enduring values that have lasted for thousands of years and should continue to last if the species doesn't destroy itself in a stupid nuclear holocaust. But to talk about something that has persisted as valuable for thousands of years is not the same as talking about an eternal truth. Eternity is a very, very, very long time. And absolutes are very, 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 very absolute. And as soon as one gets hit with an absolute and then the shoe begins to pinch, one tries to figure out how can one have one's absolute and also get around it. There's a word for that in theology. It's called casuistry. Perhaps Brother Geiszler would like to address that issue.
I think you got a very clear answer there, and that is that there are no moral absolutes. I think, however, that the secular humanist view is inconsistent. If you'll remember just a few moments ago, Dr. McKown said to us, no unwanted baby should ever be born. That's an absolute. no, never are absolutes. Now notice the absolute there has to do with the taking of life before it has a chance to speak up for itself, so there's no free speech. Humanists are against free speech of the unborn. They're against rights for unborn women. 2,500 of the babies that were killed today were women, so those women will never have any rights. In the name of humanism, they're against rights for unborn women. They're against free speech for the unborn. They're against the life of the unborn, all because someone wants to kill them. Listen, there are a lot of people after they're born that people don't want. Should we kill them? There are a lot of older people that aren't wanted. Should we kill them? That's the logic of humanism. You give up God-given absolutes that say you're made in the image and likeness of God, and there's a God with whom you have to do, and you're going to stand judgment before that God someday. You give that up, and that's exactly where your ethical position leads you.
This next question is for Dr. Geiszler. I notice that Dr. Geiszler speaks solely of man, men, and mankind. Is there no place in Dr. Geiszler or the Christian world for females? Is Christianity as sex-biased in its language as Dr. Geiszler?
Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God made he them. Male and female created he them. That's what gives woman her dignity as well as man. Woman is equal to man in the eyes of God. It's Christianity that gave woman her freedom. When she was subjected by other cultures, she was liberated. The New Testament says, in Christ there's neither male nor female, bond or free. We liberated the slaves by Christian principles, and women will be liberated by Christian principles. That's certainly not humanists who want to kill them before they can ever be born.
The God of the Old Testament, who is the same as the God of the New in point of fact, is a male, a father, a king, a judge in a capital case, one who prosecutes or shows mercy as he sees fit, and is the executioner of those who are born in original sin and with total depravity. That is Orthodox Christianity. And I'm sorry, girls and women, you are going to continue to be second-class citizens if you persist in this religion. The feminist theology movement is not going to be welcomed, I think. I wonder how many are there female pastors in your denomination, Brother Geisler? Do you ordain them? Well, there's a step ahead right there. I don't see any precedent for this in the Bible anywhere. I wonder if his values are becoming relative.
Question for Dr. McKown. Why do you base some of your arguments by quoting the Bible? It is true the devil can quote verse better than anyone. Can't you argue? I could finish. Okay, the question again. Why do you base some of your arguments by quoting the Bible? It is true the devil can quote verse better than anyone. Can't you argue for humanism without using the Bible?
I think you must recognize that to take any position whatsoever is implicitly to be prepared to deny any that contradicts your position, or at least to hold in doubt the truth of any that contradicts your position. So you can't just affirm something without at the same time being prepared to deny it. Now, as for the devil quoting Scripture, I recall a student I had one time who looked up when I tried to make a logical point using the concept of trolls, and the student said, oh, they're gross, ugly, mean little things. And it turned out that this student had never made a distinction between conceptions of trolls and honest-to-God trolls. She apparently thought that every troll she'd ever seen as a Cupid doll had been sculpted from a live model, and she seemed to have thought that every picture of a troll she had seen was not just an artist's conception, but actually a portrait of trolls. Well, that student is no longer with us. I don't know where she is. I regret that she's now gone. But she wasn't able to distinguish between conceptions of something and the real thing. Now, I know the Bible tells us that somebody's conception of the devil is that he is like an angel of light. I know that he is supposed to be able to quote Scripture. I also know that you Christians who think you've been talked to by Jesus or God may have met the devil in disguise.
I think you should notice that with respect to quoting the Bible, that on several occasions, Dr. McKown misquoted the Bible. Numbers 5 is not a recipe for abortion. It is an ancient truth test. That is a misquotation of the Bible. Hosea 9:14 is not a prayer for abortion. It is prayer for miscarriage. That is a misquotation of the Bible. Exodus 21:22 does not say that a woman had a miscarriage. The Hebrew word is yatsah, which is the word for live birth everywhere in the Old Testament. I challenge Dr. McKown to show me one place where that word means miscarriage. It is live birth, the same penalty for killing the baby as killing the mother. In fact, the word for child there is not the Hebrew word for embryo. It's a word for yaled, same word for a young child. That is a misquotation of the Bible. I'm glad humanists read the Bible, but I wish they'd read it in context. They'd get a whole lot more out of it.
Question for Dr. Geiszler. This is a question for Dr. Geiszler. If Christianity has access to ultimate answers, why has their God failed to reveal himself to the majority of humans?
God has revealed himself to all mankind. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. I gave that scientific evidence at the beginning. It's there for all objective, rational people to look at. Romans 1:19 says that since the creation, the Creator has been revealed. Every event has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. That is not what Bertrand Russell said, that everything has a cause. We don't argue that. That's a misrepresentation. We argue that only things that had a beginning had a cause. If it doesn't have any beginning, it doesn't have a cause. The atheist believed once that the universe was eternal and didn't need a cause. If the universe can be eternal and without a cause, then certainly God can be eternal without a cause. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. God has revealed himself in creation, and if something has a beginning, it must have had a beginner. The evidence is there for all. Furthermore, the Bible is available for all to read. You might even find one in the library here or in your local library or in your school library if secular humanists haven't censored it out.
Or you might come to my office where I have 10 or 12 in several different languages, and you would discover that all translations, except for the King James, that all translations, the modern language, the Living Bible, and others, are quoting that passage from Exodus exactly as I gave it to you. Now, as for this business of the universe having a beginning, we do not know yet, do we? Whether the universe goes through cyclical periods from Big Bang to Big Crunch to Big Bang to Big Crunch, world without end. We do not know that. To say that it had a beginning is, in a manner of speaking, true if you take the Big Bang to be a fact, and if you limit your science to what happened 1, 2, 3 trillionths of a second later. But no one at the present time is doing very much speculating about what might have happened before that, because in that great bang, if it happened, it may very well be that all evidence of an antecedent state was destroyed. Notice, I just say may. This is a matter for agnosticism. It is not a matter for faith.
Question for Dr. McKown. How do you explain that God's Bible, which states creation concurs perfectly with the first 3 laws of thermodynamics, which states everything is heading toward a disordered state of being? Humanists think the universe is getting more ordered.
Well, of course, what about the first law of thermodynamics, which says energy is neither created nor destroyed? What does that do to God? Now, with respect to the second law, it may very well be that on a universal scale, there has been a tendency toward disorder, but there are islands of order. They're taking place all around us. Every time a drop of water turns to a snowflake or freezes, disorder is becoming more ordered. And everyone knows at the present time that the sun gives enormously more energy to fuel evolution than is not the case. There is ample energy presently. Of course, we don't know yet, do we? Whether there was an original Big Bang followed by continuous expansion, forever and ever and ever, ending in a kind of dismal, cold, disordered universe, or whether there is going to be at some time a gravitational force bringing all matter back together to a singular point, at which time the existing laws of physics as we now understand them would at least be reversed in some cases and might perhaps be abolished. Once again, we have an issue here which is not fully comprehended, and in such situations, suspension of judgment until better data comes in is recommended, not a matter of faith. Those of you who leap into this business about faith somehow think your souls are tied up with what you believe in this. You have an angle. You think there's something to gain. You think you're going to get to live forever because you believe something correct about cosmology, and I think you ought to question that belief.
I think we should set the record straight about the first and second law. The first law is not a dogmatic philosophical principle as was articulated by faith by Dr. McKown. The first law simply means that the actual amount of energy remains constant. To say that it was never created is an act of faith. There was no one there. But we do know that observable scientific tests, and let's stick with science, which the secular humanist prides himself in, but cops out of when he's talking about ultimate issues. Science is dealing with observation, and observation says the actual amount remains constant. There were no observers of energy neither being created nor being destroyed. Secondly, the second law does give a death spell to secular humanism. The second law says in a closed, isolated system, such as the whole universe is by definition, the amount of usable energy is decreasing. It's running down. That means it cannot be eternal. It would have run down a long time ago. You can't run out of an infinite amount of energy. If you're running out of it, it can't be eternal. Therefore, the universe must have had a beginning. Now the secular humanist is faced with this alternative. Did the universe come into existence out of nothing by nothing, which one of them says, Anthony Kinney, in his book, 5 Ways? You have two choices. The Christian says someone created something from nothing. The humanist says nothing created something from nothing. Which is most rational?
Dr. Geiszler, if Christianity supports the protection of human life from conception onward, why do a large percentage of conservative fundamentalist Christians support the death penalty?
First of all, I'm sure Dr. McKown does not want to defend all humanists. He wants to defend humanism. I certainly don't want to defend all Christians. I want to defend Christianity. Christianity believes in the protection of innocent life. If capital punishment is wrong, it certainly is wrong for innocent people. And unborn children haven't committed any crimes. Let's get rid of capital punishment for the innocent.
I'm very happy to hear my opponent say that he does not wish to defend all Christians. There is no one Christianity. There are many Christianities related, and he should not be held to defending all. And he has not spoken for a large number of Christians on many points tonight. He knows that, I know that, and those Christians know that. And I'm quite glad that he gives me the privilege of not having to defend every Christian. Every humanist. There are humanists who are left of center. There are humanists who are right of center. There are some humanists who do not believe in capital punishment. There are some who do. There are humanists who are highly capitalistic. There are those who are somewhat socialistic. There are all different kinds of secular humanists, just as there are many kinds of Christians. I gave you the three fundamental points. I merely gave you a description. This description of, first of all, being philosophically naturalistic does not commit one to a position on abortion. And I happen to know an atheist whom I've just recently met who is profoundly opposed to abortion. Furthermore, the second point I gave you was just that we look to science. We are not, by and large, ourselves scientists. I think my colleague might wish to take a course in cosmology at Auburn with one of our thermodynamicists, and he might learn a few things about the second law that he hasn't enunciated very clearly. In the third case, I merely said that for secular humanism, ethics stems from, naturally, stems from humanity. That does not, of and by itself, tell us at the outset that any particular thing is good or any particular thing is bad. We have only our own human experience and our own intelligence to determine for us what is good and what is bad. We can't look to animals to find the answer to this, and I don't know of any superhumans to look to for the answer. Do you?
We will have one last question for each of the speakers. Dr. McKown, what is your explanation for the biblical account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
First place, I question whether it happened or not. Just because the tomb was empty doesn't mean that somebody dead was put in it and came out alive. First of all, the New Testament is very confused about what happened at the site. Mark's gospel has one young man in white. Matthew's gospel has an angel. Luke's has two young men, and John's gospel has two angels. Now figure that one out if you can. They can't all be true because they're contrary to each other, and maybe none of them is true. Furthermore, it's very interesting that just after Jesus is given something on a sponge, vinegar or whatever, he dies almost abruptly. This is interesting because crucifixion is a very slow death, sometimes lasting 3 or more days. Was he drugged? Did he have some part in this? Did he have friends waiting? Was the young man in white standing there really an Essene, which was the typical garb of the Essenes when they went out into the world away from the monastery? I don't have anything to explain about the resurrection because, first of all, it needs to be established. If it were established, then I might have something to explain.
I think you ought to read the Gospels carefully. First of all, Jesus turned down the drug when he was offered a drug. Secondly, the Gospels say that Jesus died. He was on the cross from 9 in the morning until almost sunset. He had 5 wounds. A spear pierced him in the side. Out came blood and water. Dr. Stroud in 1870 wrote a report on the physiological causes of Christ's death, was repeated recently by physicians showing that unquestionably Jesus Christ died. He was put in a tomb wrapped in 100 pounds of bandages and spices. He was there for 3 days. He resurrected. He was seen by 500 people. 8 of them wrote books on it. There are over 5,366 copies, Greek handwritten copies of the New Testament, hundreds of times more than any book from the ancient world with the exception of Homer's Iliad, and dozens of times more than that. There's more documentary evidence, more eyewitness evidence for the resurrection than any event in ancient history. And if humanists pride themselves in looking at the evidence and being open-minded, I recommend a book written by a man who was a skeptic, a humanist, until he looked at the facts. His name is Frank Morrison, Who Moved the Stone. He was going to write a book against Christianity, against the resurrection. The first chapter is entitled The Book That Refused to Be Written, because when he looked at the evidence, he was converted to Christianity. Simon Greenleaf, who was professor of law at Harvard, wrote a book on Christianity saying that legal evidence supports the testimony, eyewitness of the gospel accounts. You could make it stand up in court. There's the evidence. Anyone who's open-minded can look at it.
Final question for Dr. Geiszler. Dr. Geiszler, if an African tribesman who has never heard of Jesus dies, can he go to heaven?
Jesus said, "Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened." We have numerous examples of people who sought the light and were given the light. Frank Morris wrote a book on the light in Africa, of a boy in the jungle who was led out of the jungle to the light and to a missionary. and accepted Christ as his personal Savior. I was in Eastern Europe not too long ago, and a Russian girl who was seeking God was walking by a building. A Bible fell out of a building, hit her on the foot. She picked it up and read it, became a Christian. God is more interested in getting the truth to people than they are in having it. You were in the midst of a jungle and you saw one little light and it was absolutely dark. What would you do? You go for it. And when you go for light, it gets bigger. But if you turn your back on the light and go the other way, and the Bible says men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil, then the responsibility is yours. Nietzsche once said in his book Antichrist, if you could prove this God of the Christians to me, I would believe him all the less. His problem wasn't rational. His problem wasn't evidential. His problem was volitional. The Bible says the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And you reject him there, and you won't find him. But the world stands under Niagara Falls with its cup upside down, saying there's not a drop of water and there's no meaning to life. Just turn it up, and it'll be filled. Seek, and ye shall find.
Since I don't think any African tribesman is going to be saved, I don't think I need to use all of my time on that. But then I don't think anybody in Asia is going to be saved either, and I don't think anybody in the United States is going to be saved, and I don't think Brother Geisler is going to be saved. So I'll just point out that with respect to resurrections, Muhammad rode into heaven on a horse.
That concludes the question and answer section. We have a 5-minute closing statement by each of the speakers, and we will start with Dr. McKown.
One of the difficulties people like my opponent have with secular humanism is that being a secular humanist is about like having a modern secular education. It's about like having studied at a place like Auburn, perhaps even having had experience as a graduate student. It has to do with having learned something about scientific method. It has to do with using one's observational abilities and one's reason in mathematics, in logic, and in other areas. The difficulty that superstitions of all kind are having in the modern world is that same difficulty. The difficulty theological knowledge, so-called, is having is the difficulty of science being the dominant form of knowledge in the modern world. You would think that the 4,000 to 5,000 card-carrying secular humanists in this nation of nearly 240 or something over millions of people were superhuman to have done all they are accused of having done. We are just creatures of our time. We're creatures of the modern scientific age. We have taken it seriously. Other people are holding for all their worth to the way of the fathers. Their morality is the way of habit, the way of replicating the past, the way of closing their eyes to what's happening all around them, because they somehow think in that way their souls are going to be saved. We see no reason to think that we have souls. We see no reason to think that being wrong about something sends somebody into the flames forever. We see no reason to think that being right about something in a scientific sense means that one gets to have eternal bliss. We're not even thinking in the same terms. Now, people like my opponent and I, although we are both, we discovered tonight, fellow Michiganders from not more than 100 miles away, really, in the way we think, are as aliens from different planets. That's unfortunate because it has a sad message for our country. If scientific creationism, for example, really does find its way into our public school system, then people like my opponent, who really is a patriotic American, I'm sure, I never doubt this, is going to destroy what's left of science in the American public school. And everybody knows our science education is about the worst in the advanced world. If scientific creationism becomes commonplace in the primary and public schools, my colleagues in the sciences here will find science remedial for the first 2 years. That's a terrible waste of brains, it's a terrible waste of power, and it will make our country less competitive against the most advanced countries of the world. Scientific creationism has held us up to contempt and made us the laughing stock of the civilized world.
It takes a lot longer than I thought it would. I refuted the computational theory of mind 25 years ago.
Dr. McKown has said that humanism is not a religion. The Supreme Court says it is. There it is. Look at it. Torcaso case. It names them as a religion. In fact, Dr. McKown, in his own testimony before the court here, was asked this question: do you believe in any of the 40 concepts of God? Yes, one. Which one? Spinozaism. Spinoza was a pantheist. Spinoza was excommunicated from the synagogue. They're monotheists. Spinoza was the father of modern naturalism. He wrote a book, Tractatus, in which he eliminated all miracles from the Bible and said it can't be believed. It's a religion, and you're being taught that religion here at Auburn by taxpayers' money by one of the foremost religionists in this section of the country. Notice also that the Constitution does have reference to religion. It says there's total freedom of religion. That is freedom of religion except the Judeo-Christian beliefs in the public schools. Because between 1961 and 1981, the Supreme Court, and in one case a lower court, now before the Supreme Court, ruled that you cannot have class prayers, you cannot have class Bible reading, you cannot forbid the teaching of evolution, but you can forbid the teaching of creation. That's called open-mindedness. It says you cannot post the 10 Commandments on a bulletin board. You could put up the Humanist Manifesto, but God forbid that we should put the 10 Commandments on the bulletin board in the public school. It might scare some little kid to know thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not commit adultery, part of the problem behind the teenage pregnancy in America. We are told that unborn aren't human by the Supreme Court. The last time the Supreme Court said some segment of our society wasn't human, we had a civil war. And most people in the country have now come to recognize that that was an intolerable wrong. And it's also an intolerable wrong to say the unborn aren't human. The scientific evidence is for it. Where was the scientific evidence that humanists pride themselves in to the unborn is not human? They have their own brainwave, their own heartbeat, their own fingerprint, their own sex. It could be a boy. They are separate individual human beings. They're not an extension of their mother's body. They're just nesting and feeding there, and we're not protecting them. The only place in America, the most dangerous place in America to live today is inside a woman's womb before you're born. And the Supreme Court is about to rule on the case that lower courts have said you can't teach creation alongside of evolution as one of two scientific theories of origin, not religious. There are many religious views, but there are only two scientific views, a naturalistic one or a supernatural one. The humanists happen to be naturalists. They want their naturalistic point of view taught. They happen to be anti-supernaturalists. They don't want the supernatural view taught. Now, is that fair to have your view taught and not the others? Take a good look at your birth certificate, because you heard him here tonight. He said that the Declaration of Independence, in effect, is not constitutionally binding. Now, if the Declaration of Independence isn't constitutional, if belief in creator, creation, and God-given moral absolutes aren't constitutional, if you can't put the 10 Commandments on a bulletin board, you can't pray, you can't read the Bible, then the only thing that seems to be unconstitutional is the very Judeo-Christian values which were the basis of our country to begin with. That reveals the hand of the secular humanists. They are religion, they are a militant religion, they are an anti-Christian religion, they are a religion that wants only their views taught in the public school. That is bias, that is bigotry, and that must be stopped.
Thank you for your attention. You've been a very